Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm Rob Reid.
And I'm Tom Merritt. And this is a special episode designed around the book After On.
Each of these special episodes focuses on one aspect of the science, tech, and social issues explored in the novel. Now, you don't have to read After On in order to learn from or enjoy these podcasts.
That's because we wait until the very end to discuss the book in detail and to really tie it to this week's topic.
That last section will make perfect sense if you're reading the novel. But if you're not reading it, just tune out at that point. You can always come back if you decide to read it later.
And we'll warn you before we get to that part. But first, we have a lot of things to talk about, which should be interesting to everybody.
Hopefully, including this message. This is a quick update from Rob before what I promise will be a truly fascinating interview with British astronomer Stephen Webb about Fermi's Paradox. This is the question of where all the aliens are, given that we've seen no sign of extraterrestrial intelligence despite living in a universe whose vast and ancient nature has given aliens plenty of space and time in which to emerge. My guest today wrote a book on this subject, appropriately called Where Is Everybody? I read it shortly after it came out in 2002, and it blew my mind because it taught me to respect the seemingly frivolous question that you might briefly bat around after seeing Star Wars or something. Where are all the aliens? Are they secretly among us, studying us from afar, or non-existent? Stephen's book taught me that this is actually a profoundly momentous and scientifically serious question. But first, that quick update. As regular listeners know, I've been trying to decide whether to continue with this podcast after the first 8 episodes, which have been loosely tied to my novel, After On. As this is episode 8, I now owe you an answer. And that answer is, yes, I am continuing. The 2 main reasons are that I'm having a huge amount of fun, and the audience is large, for me anyway, and it's growing. For someone who likes to share stories, ideas, and conversations with the world, that's a big deal. And in case you're wondering, my weekly audience is now in the low tens of thousands, which is trivial for anyone truly large in media or even in podcasting, but my day job is writing works of speculative fiction, the most recent of which hurts a great deal if dropped on one's foot from even a very low height. And trust me, if that's what you normally create, tens of thousands of people is a lot. So I appreciate everybody's presence, everybody listening, and I want to honor it by keeping things going. So what's coming up? The theme of the podcast will now be unhurried conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists, which is a pretty good description of what it's been up to now, so it won't be a jarring shift. The only difference is we've been featuring that segment at the end in which Tom Merritt and I relate the interview back to the book. Tom and I will be doing that today for the last time. I will definitely miss you, Tom. As for what's coming up, I'm recording this just a few hours before posting this very episode, and though I'm normally based in New York City, right now I'm in San Francisco, and over the next 24 hours, I will be conducting my next 2 interviews. So, next week's episode will feature my conversation with a guy named Chris Anderson. Now, there are multiple prominent Chris Andersons out there. This one was the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine for 12 years and is now the founder and CEO of 3D Robotics, one of the most prominent drone companies in the world. Chris and I will talk about his kind of remarkable personal background for somebody who's doing what he's doing, a bit about his tenure at Wired, and then we'll go really deep into the world of drones, the amazing things they're already doing, the still more amazing things they're likely to do in the next 5 to 10 years, and the story of his amazing company, 3D Robotics. The following week, I'll be talking with a true tech industry legend, Tim O'Reilly. The date of that episode, October 10th, is significant because it's the release date of Tim's new book. It's called WTF, and no, it's not co-written by Mark Maron. It officially stands for What's the Future, at least on the cover of Tim's book. And it's a combination of personal memoir, tech strategy guide, and manifesto. This is significant because Tim's been one of the industry's top thinkers, writers, and publishers since the late 70s. Almost every major shift in tech, particularly since the dawn of the internet, has been at least partly catalyzed at an elite retreat that Tim has arranged for industry honchos or a limited run conference that he's organized. Not an exaggeration, seriously. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. I get to have it in a couple hours, and you get to hear it on October 10th. Also in October, I'll be sitting down with another prominent Chris Anderson, this one the guy who runs the TED conference. Speaking of TED, also next month I'll be interviewing Sarah Parcak, the most recent winner of the $1 Million TED Prize and creator of the field of astroarchaeology. Later on, I'll be talking to life extension guru Aubrey de Grey, MIT's Andrew McAfee, who is helping to lead the worldwide conversation on what automation will do to employment in the intermediate future, and many others. It's going to be a really exciting October, so thank you everyone for listening, and particularly thanks to those of you who have encouraged me to continue via Twitter, Facebook, iTunes reviews, especially iTunes reviews, direct emails, the works. Your feedback means a ton to me, and it's a huge reason why I'm continuing. And since I am continuing, I'd like to encourage all of you who haven't yet to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are distributed, because it's officially an ongoing thing. And now, on to our interview with Stephen Webb. So, Stephen Webb, thank you so much for making time for me across the internet and across the time zones to talk about these fascinating topics.
It's a pleasure to talk with you, Rob.
Before we get into Fermi's Paradox and the anthropic coincidences, which are going to be our topics, I thought we would talk briefly about your own personal background. One thing you told me previously in an earlier conversation is that a very formative element of your background was a deep appreciation for science fiction when you were growing up and after growing up. Do you care to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a science fictional world, Rob. I mean, when I was a kid, people were walking on the moon. I mean, how exciting is that? On television, we had Star Trek. So it was on television, it was in the culture. And I read lots of science fiction, especially Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, the big three, and Isaac Asimov in particular. And Martin Rees, Lord Rees, he's one of the greatest living astrophysicists. He's fond of saying that you can learn more from first-rate science fiction than you can from third-rate science. And I think that's dead right. So I went to Bristol University. I studied physics, had the privilege of being taught optics by Sir Michael Berry. Real privilege. I'm used to one of the great theoretical physicists. I went on to do a PhD at Manchester in quantum chromodynamics. Still reading science fiction, and that's actually where I first came across the Fermi Paradox.
It was in a work of science fiction that you came across Fermi's Paradox?
It was in Asimov's science fiction magazine, which would have been in the mid-'80s. The magazine itself is still going strong. It's in its 40th anniversary year. I have all the issues. But mid-'80s, a couple of articles appeared in back-to-back issues. It's primarily now a fiction outlet. It always has been. But those articles, they were science articles. And the first argued that maybe there is something paradoxical about this idea that aliens, high civilizations, exist out there. And the rebuttal article in the next issue was saying this is nonsense on stilts. Of course, we can't conclude anything. Fermi himself, if I can just give you a little bit of background.
Yes, please.
So Enrico Fermi, he was an Italian theoretical physicist and experimentalist. He did a lot of his work in America. He was a Nobel Prize winner. He was a great physicist. He's been called the father of the nuclear age. It's probably worth for your listeners to understand the time that he was working. So he was born in 1901, and he died early, 1954. And the reason I mention that is that when he was born, humanity was essentially a terrestrial species, by which I mean it was before the Wright brothers. You know, I guess you could get off the ground, but it would have required a balloon or something. So he was born into a world where we couldn't even fly in an airplane. And he died after humanity had just about touched space with the V2 rocket. But it was clear that same technology would get us into orbit, into space. And had he lived a long life, actually, admittedly a centenarian, but he'd have seen us just reach the edge of interstellar space with the Voyager 1 crafts, just getting to the edge of the solar system. So I just want to say, put that into some sort of context. Within one human lifespan, he would have seen huge technological progress.
And an interesting historical note, which is more geopolitical than scientific history, but he lived under Mussolini for a period of time and fled the fascist government in World War II, correct?
Indeed. Yes, he spent the last years of his career in America, having fled, and obviously was influential in the Manhattan Project. His colleagues used to call him the Pope because he was infallible, so they said. I think he was the last physicist that was equally at home with experiment and theory. So he made profound discoveries theoretically in nuclear physics, but also he was capable of doing the experiments. And you don't get that anymore.
He also asked this profound question. So let's talk about the question that he asked and what he meant by it.
Okay, so yeah, as far as we know, he didn't, well, I do know he didn't publish anything on aliens or the lack thereof, which has led some people to say, well, this isn't a paradox and it's not Fermi's. But we do know, as a matter of record, in 1950, that he asked this question, where is everybody? He was going to lunch Los Alamos one day. A cartoon had made humorous reference to flying saucers, and they were discussing the possibility of these things being alien craft. And out of the blue, he asked, where is everybody? So I think we have to ask, what did he mean, and why actually is it perhaps a profound question? So he didn't mean by that question that extraterrestrials don't exist. So he'll have done a quick estimate and come up with a large number of extraterrestrial civilizations.
That in theory should have existed in his mind, just knowing what he knew about the scope of the cosmos.
Indeed. And that estimate that he'll have made, we now call it now goes by the name of the Drake equation, because Frank Drake, an American astronomer, he first wrote it down about 10 years later, 1960.
He formalized it later, but when Fermi was asking it, we can assume that Fermi had his own solution to the Drake equation, which we'll discuss in detail in a moment. And the paradox was, gosh, there should be a lot of them. Why on earth have they not yet come here?
Exactly.
No pun intended with why on earth, yes.
Exactly. I think that's it. He'll have done in his head, he'll have assigned variables to what we now call the Drake equation and come up with a large number. The question then, where is everybody, is paradoxical, because if you come up with this large number for putative extraterrestrial civilizations, you have to ask yourself, well, where are they? Why don't we see them? The universe seems devoid of life. People have called it the Great Silence. So where are they? Where is everybody?
There are so many fascinating mutually inconsistent answers to that question, which we will dive into in a moment. But because the Drake equation has come up, it's probably worth giving it a quick overview, because that starts to put the profound nature of this paradox into context.
Okay, so the Drake equation, it's not an equation like Einstein's E equals mc squared or Newton's F equals ma. It's a tool for organizing our ignorance, really. It's a way of making an estimate for this number n, which is the number of civilizations in our galaxy with whom communication might be possible.
And it's important to note that it's our galaxy, one of at least 100 billion that we can see.
Exactly. So whatever answers we come up with for the galaxy, potentially you can multiply it by 100 billion or so for everything else that's out there.
And there's 7 terms, right, I think?
As Drake initially wrote it down, yes. So n, which is this number that we're after, it's equal to r, which is the average rate of star formation per galaxy. And you multiply that by the fraction of stars with planets. You multiply that by the average number of planets that could potentially have an environment that could support life per star. You multiply that by the fraction that can go on to support life. You multiply that by the fraction that can go on to support intelligent life. You multiply that by the fraction of civilizations that develop a technology that potentially we could detect from space. And then you multiply that by L, which is the length of time that these civilizations would choose to release signals into space. So there's 7 terms there. You mash them all together. You make your best estimate of each of these terms. You mash them all together, and that gives you n, which is the number of civilizations. I think the interesting thing is that when Fermi was thinking of these things in about 1950, he really would have had to have estimated all of those terms. So he wouldn't really have known much about any of them.
Even the number of stars in the galaxy was somewhat mysterious at that point.
Perhaps less well known than we know it now.
Than now, yeah.
He would have given a really, really good estimate of them. And his attitude was, well, sometimes you overestimate things, sometimes you underestimate things. It all comes out in the wash when you mash all these things together and you multiply them together. But those first 3 terms, average rate of star formation, fraction of stars with planets, average number of planets that could potentially support life, astronomy's come on hugely in the years since 1950. It's massive progression. The far terms on the right, your guess is as good as mine. That final term, L, the length of time that civilizations are doing this activity, I mean, that's potentially chilling, because we have a reason just right there why we might not expect to see them if L is small.
Yeah, so to just go through the terms real quick, it is interesting that when Mr. Drake and Mr. Fermi were first considering this, all 7 were shots in the dark. We now really have a good sense of the number of stars and how fast they're formed. And as you said, really in the last, is it at 15 or 20 years, or even in the last particularly 10-ish years, we've gotten much, much, much greater data on the number of planets that a typical star has because of the Kepler probe and other things. And we're starting to identify how common it is for a planet to be in the so-called habitable zone. And these numbers, both of these terms, are probably quite a bit higher than either Fermi or Drake would have estimated decades ago. Is that correct?
That's right. When Fermi was around, it would have been possible, I think, to argue that planetary formation was actually quite rare. Mm-hmm. Some astronomers were still arguing, I believe, back then, that planets came into existence when 2 stars underwent a close encounter, a collision, if you like, and that collision would rip material off that could create then planets. Now we know that basically, if you have a star, you've got planets. You mentioned Kepler. That's a space telescope. It's basically staring at about 145,000 stars unblinkingly, and it's just looking for periodic dimming in those stars. And the periodic dimming represents just a slight occultation, a little eclipse, if you like, as a planet goes in front of the star, just blocks a little bit of the light out. And we're at that level of technology where we can, from that tiny, tiny dimming, deduce the presence of exoplanets and exoplanetary systems. And we know that stars now pretty much have planets. So we can't say that the reason for this question, where is everybody, lies in the fact that there's no planets. Probably there'll be, I don't know, 1 trillion or so planets in the galaxy. That's a huge number. And when you try and whittle away that trillion via these other factors in the Drake equation, you still tend to end up with a number that's quite large. Whenever I go through this with students or with members of the public in talks, I mean, typically people come up with a number that's a few thousand, 5,000, 10,000 or so. I don't know what Frank Drake would say, but that's typically what people come up with for this number of civilizations.
I actually do know what Frank Drake would say. So I have a funny story. I've met Frank Drake a couple of times. Some years ago, the TED conference had, they still have something called the TED Wish. It's also sometimes called the TED Prize. It's basically the TED community rallies around 1 or 2 interesting public figures and quote unquote grants them a wish. And, the TED community and its members and its resources and their resources and assets and Rolodexes try to grant a wish for somebody who has an interesting idea or problem that they'd like to solve. And one year, it was Jill Tarter who started SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which we'll talk about in a moment. And she was famously the person that the movie Contact was based upon. And Jill won one of the TED wishes one year. And because I'm pretty heavily involved in the TED community, I ended up kind of helping her interface with TED because I was living pretty close to SETI's headquarters in those days. And one day I was in the office and Mr. Drake was there. And I asked him, I was like, so what's your solution to the Drake equation? And he went through those 7 terms. And of course, the first 3 terms, which had been educated guesses in the past, we know pretty well, but you get into those last 4 terms and it's like, it does start becoming questionable. Like, we have a pretty good number of how many planets could bear life now, but how many planets did life actually emerge on? Got to take an educated guess. How many of those planets yielded intelligent life? Got to take an educated guess. Boom, 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 go down the list. He came up with 10,000. So it's quite consistent with what you said, folks out in the broader public. Yeah.
So, wisdom of crowds, let's go with 10,000 extraterrestrial civilizations out there. But then that sets up the paradoxical element. Because the other big number in opposition to this is the age of the galaxy. So we know the universe is 13.8 billion years old. And so we can expect many civilizations to have come into existence long ago. So the problem is, suppose you, to give some idea of what we're talking about, suppose you compress the age of the universe into 1 year. And then on that scale, human civilization began about 20 seconds before the stroke of midnight on 31st of December. So we're very, very late. Those other civilizations, they might have come into being in June or July. I mentioned Fermi's own life. If you compress the age of the universe into 1 year, well, he lived about 1/10 of a second on that scale.
The last 1/10 of a second before midnight on New Year's Eve, in a sense.
And in that 0.1 of a second, the human species went from being terrestrial to spacefaring.
That gulf of time is as big as the galaxy itself. When is the earliest we could imagine a civilization coming into existence over the 13-ish billion years? For many billions of years, there's no way an intelligent civilization would have arisen because at the very, very beginning, there were no stars. For a period of time, there were stars, but there weren't enough heavy elements. Starting when-ish? You said 5 or 6 billion years ago. Is that about the time that we would expect if life were abundant, life would have first started popping into existence?
Well, if you believe that it is, there's almost this imperative, if it's possible, life's going to get going, then there's no reason, I don't think, that it couldn't have got going 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago. And that's an awful long time when you consider that the time scale for colonizing the galaxy, if a civilization wanted to do such a thing, which you can measure on a scale of perhaps 1 million years or 5 million years, so something like that. The timescale for colonization is much, much, much shorter than that 3 billion years, say, during which civilizations could have come into being.
When I first read your book, this is one of the things that really fascinated me, was how quickly, once you get to a certain point of technology, which is that you can crawl your way to the nearest star much faster than we could go today, but not impossibly fast. It is a remarkably short period of time before a civilization moving at even a leisurely pace would tend to fill the galaxy. And you have some very rigorous equations in your book, and others have done them out in the broader world, and it is just a few million years.
You have to make assumptions.
Yes, of course.
It's possible to imagine, if we're talking about humanity or a technologically advanced species lasting thousands of years, an immense level of technology, and hopefully you would imagine one of those civilizations, or humanity, if we last that long, will crack this problem. And then and again, it's a big if, but if you chose as a civilization to go out and colonize the galaxy for whatever reason. There are search and exploration programs that you can imagine that would swamp the galaxy really on a very, very short timescale, even less than 1 million years if you put your mind to it and your effort. So that when you ask this question, where is everybody? Well, you could argue, under some assumptions at least, that they should actually already be here.
Yeah, and so if taking this 10,000 figure again, let's just assume that the most experienced mind in this question in the world, Frank Drake's, is roughly correct, and there's 10,000-ish intelligent civilizations. If you make that assumption, and if you say that life could have started here in the Milky Way some 3 billion years ago, that would tell us that there are civilizations that are billions of years older than ours, hundreds of millions, tens of millions, millions. And the fascinating thing is that when you look at the rate of technological change, as you indicated in talking about Fermi's life, look how far we've come in 100 years. It's almost inconceivable to think of how advanced we'll be in merely another century. 1,000 years hence will be so unfathomably advanced. And so then you say there's 10,000 civilizations. They've arisen over a period of 3 billion years. Let's say we're the youngsters because we're just getting to that point of awareness. Yes, where is everybody becomes a burning, burning question. And one of the chilling elements of the answer to that is what you alluded to earlier. What is the length of time that a civilization lasts after it gets to the point where it becomes detectable, when it starts, spewing radio waves and TV waves and rocket ships out into the universe? If that number is essentially indefinite, we should be swarmed with aliens at this point because they're so far advanced. They ain't here. Therefore, either they all die off or one of 74 other possibilities come up.
They're not here. But it's more than that. We don't see any evidence of their grand projects. We don't see evidence for Dyson spheres or antimatter rockets or these relativistic spacecraft or the signals that we hope that they'd be sending each other or us. That they don't seem to be disturbing the universe in ways that we can imagine them doing.
Yep. And they've had plenty of time. They've had plenty of time and plenty of planets to grow up on, so something is weird.
So something's weird, and I think it's now reaching the stage because of advances in astronomy and cosmology, where it's really becoming actually one of the pressing questions in science. Where are they?
Where are they? And to pitch your books, because I just want to, because I love them, you wrote your first book on this topic, late 90s, wasn't it? Or 2000?
About 2000, yes.
About 2000, and it is called Where is Everybody? And it has 50 solutions to this question, 50 possible solutions. And your follow-on book, just a couple of years ago, is an update that has 75 possible solutions. I love the structure of the book. It's very elegant, and it is a perfect structure for the rest of our conversation because you cluster the solutions into 3 broad categories. One set of solutions says they are here or they were here. We'll get into that because those are fun, particularly for science fiction authors. The second set says they exist, they're out there, but we have yet to see or hear from them. And there's lots of possible explanations that revolve around that. And the third is that they don't exist and we are simply alone, either in the galaxy or perhaps in the universe. And there's a bunch of answers surrounding that. There's no way we can go into all 75, obviously, but why don't we talk through each of these potential clusters of solutions, starting with they are or were here. That would be UFOs and X-Files. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
It would indeed mean that, and it's the most popular solution to the paradox. Mm-hmm. And science isn't a democratic activity. I think some people get confused about this. Just because it's the popular solution doesn't mean to say that it is in any way accepted by science. But people do say, well, they are here. And they'll point as evidence to UFOs, to crop circles, pyramids. Now, UFOs, clearly they do exist. I've seen one myself. But the U in that acronym is unidentified. And I think there's no reason to identify them by saying that they're alien craft. Yeah, clearly there's UFO sightings, that's undeniable. And even after investigation, some of them remain unidentified. But then murders remain unsolved. We don't know the identity of Jack the Ripper. We can't know the reason behind all UFOs. So personally, I don't think that hypothesis carries much weight.
And that is the overwhelming consensus too, right? I mean, it's if you look at the community of scientifically informed people who have looked into this and have opined on it, the consensus is perhaps even greater than that surrounds climate change, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So UFOs, they tend to come in one of two forms. There's the unidentified aerial phenomena that lots of people see. It's videoed, it's on camera, and fine, it's an unidentified phenomena. And then you have the really interesting ones that would actually prove the existence of aliens. UFO comes down, car lights go off, aliens get out of the craft, they abduct someone, do all the probing that always seems to go on in these stories, and then return the people. That would be proof, except, of course, that's never captured on video, on camera, or with any other evidence to support the claim.
Yep.
So if you're going to make this big claim that extraterrestrials are whizzing around and interfering with human life, I think it's reasonable to ask for a lot of evidence to back that up, that claim, and that evidence is never forthcoming. So I don't think that can be taken seriously. But I do know scientists that take seriously the idea, for instance, of the zoo hypothesis, which is that aliens are perhaps observing us as we would observe animals in a zoo, and perhaps for this idea of the prime directive that used to come from Star Trek. Perhaps they just don't want to interfere with us. They're trying to avoid contact with primitive civilizations.
Or maybe like a safari when you try to observe and take only pictures and leave only footprints because you don't want to interfere with the lions and other critters in their natural habitat.
Absolutely. There are a couple of things I find difficult about that idea. You've just advanced a very civilized way of looking at going on safari. And of course, some human cultures would go on safari and shoot animals.
Yes.
So there isn't even cultural homogeneity here on Earth. It's difficult to imagine every alien species would have this idea of a prime directive and this idea of leaving civilizations unhindered.
You'd need a uniform consensus because if, again, let's take our informed guess number of 10,000 civilizations, not merely would one of them need to have the scruples of the Enterprise, but all 10,000 of them would have to basically be adhering to the same rules of let's not mess with these primitive societies. And that seems less likely when we consider the vast diversity that we would imagine intelligent alien societies to have.
Absolutely. That's, I think, encapsulates my feeling perfectly. And of course, there's the other difficulty that suppose they do come to this agreement and that they want to class Earth as being out of bounds. That's fine, but could they really hide all traces of their activity? Remember that we don't see any signs of their ships, their astroengineering projects, their relativistic craft, their communications. Would they be able to hide all traces? Actually, presumably, if they're sufficiently advanced, yeah, probably they could. But then you've got zero chance of taking this idea forward because the continued lack of evidence, you can always explain away and just say, well, they've got this superior tech that means they can always hide from us.
Yeah, and then it just becomes a faith-based statement, really. You say that the absence of evidence is further proof. That to me is sort of like my wife were having a surprise party for me. She might tee things up in the apartment in such a way that I'd have no idea that 30 of my friends were hiding around the next corner. But she wouldn't take over the entire city of New York and somehow scrub that of evidence. But if we imagine a prime directive civilization, it would be one thing to say, hands off, nobody gets to go to Earth. But to say, okay, we're not going to build Dyson spheres, we're not going to do any kind of visible astroengineering, we're going to make the entire universe seem uninhabited so that these primitives can come to their own moral conclusions and create their own great art, that starts seeming like a pretty hefty price for them to pay in terms of living their own lives with their own technology in order to maintain the surprise party for us.
Precisely.
Something that fascinated me as a child was Eric von Daniken. He wrote this book, Chariots of the Gods. That was a monster bestseller, I think, back in the 70s. And he posited that no way could primitive people have built the pyramids or dug these tunnels in Peru or build this temple or that temple. Or if you look at this thing from the air, it looks like a hawk. But if you look at it from the ground, it doesn't look like anything. Therefore, there had to be somebody with an airplane. And so it was ancient astronauts. And that one just fascinated me because for some reason, it fascinated my very level-headed father. He was so intrigued by that set of solutions. So I heard about it a lot when I was a kid. But that's basically they are or were here. Fun, great storytelling to be had around it, but very few, if any, credible experts put a whole lot of stock into that. Which brings us to the second set of things, which is they exist, but we have yet to see or hear from them. And maybe as a transition into that, we could talk briefly about the SETI project, because we have actually been listening very, very closely. So the significance of us not hearing from them is greater than it would have been if we hadn't been listening.
Indeed. And we began by talking about the Drake equation. Well, Frank Drake wrote down that equation to give him some framework for thinking about this search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're looking for signals. What do we want from a signal? You want it to go as fast as possible, your signal. So that implies light waves or gravitational waves. There's an economic argument as well, presumably. You want it to be easy to produce your signals. So that rules out gravitational waves, because basically you need to shake a black hole vigorously to create gravitational waves. And neutrinos are hard to modulate. But light waves, electromagnetic waves, dead easy to produce. They go at the fastest possible speed, and they'll go where you want them to go. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, primarily since Frank Drake initiated this, has been the search for electromagnetic radiation from possible extraterrestrial sources. But yes, so far the result is silence.
It's worth noting that SETI has kind of meant a couple different things over time. So it is an activity, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And as more and more energy gathered around this, and as Frank Drake gathered more believers and interested people, it became formalized into, for a period of time, it was actually U.S. government funded. And then at some point, the SETI organization became a private donor-backed organization. And so SETI is both an activity, and it often refers to the SETI organization, which has been home to Frank for a long period of time, and has also been home to Jill Tarter, who ran the SETI organization for many years. And at sort of the peak of their funding, Paul Allen helped them build a very large array of telescopes. So it ebbs and flows with the funding and so forth. But this activity of SETI has been formal and fairly rigorous and methodical. I mean, thousands upon thousands of stars have been scanned on very, very, very wide sets of frequencies. And we have yet to pick up anything that seems to be in any way artificial in origin. All we've been hearing as we've been scanning these thousands of stars on these countless frequencies is just sort of static noise.
Absolutely. But you have to listen to find out. And we are. And people have since Frank Drake initiated it. But it is very, very, very difficult. It's much more difficult than finding the proverbial needle in the haystack. We have to have our telescope looking at the right time, in precisely the right direction, at the right wavelength. It's a huge parameter space that we need to explore. And you can imagine a telescope looking at the correct star at the correct wavelength, but just not at the right time.
Yeah.
And so who knows? So we need to engage in SETI for a long time before we can really conclude that silence means silence.
Yeah. And then there is the possibility that they are out there, but they're not broadcasting.
Absolutely. I mean, the flip side of SETI is METI, or active SETI, so messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. And there's been some discussion amongst scientists, people like Stephen Hawking, about the wisdom of broadcasting a signal, because it gives away your presence. I've heard it suggested that maybe actually everyone's too scared to broadcast. So maybe everyone's listening, no one's actually transmitting. There's a science fiction hypothesis called the Berserker hypothesis, that instead of seeking out new life and new civilization as Star Trek would have it, it's seek out new life, new civilization, and kill it. The idea being that if you kill all organic life out there, the galaxy is yours and all of that real estate. Maybe you don't want to take that risk.
Yep.
Could it be that these 10,000 civilizations are all listening, waiting for the first move to come from someone else?
And another possibility is they've fallen silent for completely benign reasons. Looking at our own civilization as we get more and more technically advanced, we are broadcasting less and less, and we are broadcasting in a less and less leaky manner. The way that TV and radio would broadcast many decades ago was, blasting out electromagnetic waves in all directions. And now we're getting much more point to point with satellites. We're putting lots of things on fiber optic cables. And it's entirely possible that the noisy period of a civilization's history is only a few decades or maybe a century, which may well be the situation with us, correct?
Absolutely. And I said perhaps civilizations would want to go out and explore. Maybe as virtual realities and virtual life becomes more and more common, maybe our own civilization will find it actually much more stimulating, interesting, just to stay at home and explore those virtual realities as opposed to real realities. It seems plausible, looking at the way we're heading, that we're much more interested in inner space than outer space.
Particularly when you think of the expense of getting to another star. I mean, for the cost that it would take us in terms of energy, risk, directing technological innovation, all that energy could go into, as you said, creating these virtual environments and things that are fascinating us more and more, particularly before Elon Musk came along and put the possibility of going to Mars on the near-term agenda. Certainly when I read the first version of your book, that seemed overwhelmingly plausible to me because it was 2000, I think, when I first read it. It's been 30 years since we've been to the moon. We haven't been anywhere close to the moon since then. The year 2000, the internet's getting better and better. You could see virtual reality on the intermediate horizon, and it was very, very easy to contemplate that we would just become a very inward-lurking species. So it seemed then very, very plausible that a highly advanced civilization would be perfectly content on a pretty small sliver of their planet where they could access experiences and wisdom and philosophies that we could never contemplate merely by exploration of the galaxy.
That's right. And a lot of these things obviously are dependent upon the technology that we're familiar with at a particular time. And it's interesting, I think, that possible solutions to the Fermi Paradox, they develop over time as our own technology develops.
So that is one of my favorite parts of the book is they exist, but we have yet to see or hear from them. There are literally dozens of solutions there, but we keep running into what you call cultural homogeneity, which is, you could see why we might just end up surfing the net if, Elon's project doesn't work out and, Oculus Rift 3.0 is really cool. We could see maybe even 5,000 of the 10,000 civilizations, but that the presumption that 100% all aliens in all circumstances at all times will choose to surf the net or do any one of the dozens of things in that large section of the book, it really falls down there. It just takes one exception and the universe is full. And it's not full.
Yeah. And it just needs one civilization to follow the logic that if we get out there first, the galaxy is ours.
We win.
Yeah, we win.
Yeah. This is an aside. There is this one rather fun thing that's going on. Would you like to talk just briefly about Tabby's star and what the fun explanation is and what is perhaps more plausible?
Yeah, it's It's a real astronomical mystery. It's great fun. It's the weirdest star in the galaxy. It's named Tabby's star after Tabitha Boyajian, I believe is how you pronounce it.
And she's at Yale, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's about 1,280 light years from Earth. What makes it weird is that Kepler, this space telescope that's looking for these periodic dips in brightness, is seeing dips in brightness from Tabby's star, but they're not regular. They're small, they're frequent dips, but they're non-periodic. And there's been 2 large dips as well, about a 15% dimming and about a 22% dimming, I believe.
And these dimmings are completely inconsistent with what we see from planets. So whatever is occluding Tabby's star on a periodic basis does not appear to be a planet. It appears to be very large, and it appears to be circling it or doing something at an erratic intervals.
Yeah. I mean, if it were a Jupiter-sized object that was transiting, you'd see a 1% dip in brightness. So we're seeing lots of these small, non-periodic dips in brightness. It's not a planet going round in a regular orbit, because it's non-periodic. Then you've got these 2 huge dips that it's very difficult to imagine being a planet. So it's not clear at all what's going on. I mean, stars just don't do this.
Right.
You get variable stars, but they don't vary in this particular way. So what's going on?
The one fun explanation is that somebody is building a Dyson sphere, just a great big sphere that will eventually be complete and opaque and capture 100% of the solar energy that this star throws off. That's something that people have talked about as being a plausible astroengineering project for many decades now. That could be one fun explanation, is like someone's building that sucker right now.
It would be an incredible coincidence to be around just when someone's building one of these things so close.
Right.
But it's something that fits the observations. So people have come up with possible explanations, a swarm of comets, perhaps, or maybe a really big giant planet with a ring structure. None of these explanations somehow smell quite right. We don't know what's going on.
I've seen a takedown of a debunking of the comet explanation. It was pretty persuasive.
Exactly. And I think at present, the answer is we don't know what's going on.
For anybody who's listening to this and finds this intriguing, Google it, Tabby's star, and follow the story because it is ongoing.
Yes, do. I would urge your listeners to Google this and keep on top of the story, because there will be other dips in brightness coming if the past is anything to go by.
So again, there are literally dozens of solutions to they exist, but we have yet to see or hear from them. To get to that third category now, the least fun one for fans of science fiction. In many obvious ways, a very chilling explanation, but in more subtle ways, a very optimistic set of explanations, which is there are no intelligent aliens in the galaxy and perhaps even the universe. And that is, again, a collection of a couple dozen solutions. So talk us through the big picture on that, please.
Well, we could just take the great silence at face value and say it's a silent universe because no one's out there. It's just us. So one idea based around this is the idea of hard steps or difficult steps. So maybe reaching the stage of advanced intelligence. It's like the 110-meter hurdle race. You've got to get over one hurdle, and then you've got to get over another hurdle, and then another one in a certain order. You only need a few of those hard steps to make it unlikely that there'll be extraterrestrial intelligence. If it's 1 trillion to 1 shot, well, fine, there's 1 trillion planets, it's going to happen somewhere.
And we're that one.
and we're that one. We don't know, for example, how dead matter becomes live. We've got some ideas. Biologists have got some very good ideas, but we don't actually know. We do know, actually, that it happened really quickly on Earth, pretty much as soon as conditions were plausible for life to be here on Earth. Life was here on Earth.
And that's one of the things that adds a great deal of energy to Fermi's paradox, because when you look at the 4 billion-ish year history of Earth, it is right about the very time where it first became possible for life to arise, that it happened here. We might have just gotten lucky in that case. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easy for non-life to arise from life, correct?
That's correct. It might mean that it's easy, and that's what people have tended to think. But we can't say it for sure, because if it takes 4 billion years to evolve intelligence, we have to find ourselves on a planet where life started early.
Yeah.
So it's entirely possible that this transition from dead matter to life is one of those hard steps. What we need to do is try and find life elsewhere.
Yeah.
If we can find life on Mars or Enceladus, it's a moon of Saturn, or on Titan, one of these places. If we can find life there and we can show that it evolved independently or came into being independently of evolution of life on Earth, then we know pretty much we're going to find life everywhere.
Yeah, that would be kind of the equivalent of the Kepler telescope suddenly realizing, wow, there are a lot of planets in the habitable zone. We thought there may be, we really had no way of knowing in the 1950s when Frank Drake was first thinking about this stuff. Now we have Kepler and we do have a way of knowing, but you're precisely the same way. If we find completely independently evolved life on Mars with a different code of life, something that clearly independently arose, then that will suggest vehemently that life does spring up kind of wherever it can, and we've solved yet another of the 7 terms of the Drake equation in a positive manner.
Absolutely. We need to go out there and look. We have to. Another one would be the transition, another hard step potentially would be this transition from simple single-celled life to complex multicellular life. What we do know that here on Earth, life really didn't do much for billions of years.
Yeah.
It was just basic, simple, single-celled life.
And that was about 3 billion years, correct? We had this almost obscenely, suspiciously immediate emergence of simple life. But once we had those single-cell critters, it was literally about 3 billion years of that and nothing else before anything more complex arose.
That's right. And it was doing its own stuff. It was living.
Yep.
But it wasn't going to build a radio telescope.
Right.
So maybe that's a difficult transition.
Well, it certainly is from our experience. If it took 3 billion years, it's got to be highly improbable that it will happen on any given day. The evidence that we have from our own history certainly seems to show that that is a giant, difficult, improbable step that takes lots of time.
Indeed. And there are other possible difficult steps that people can come up with. So the development of sexual reproduction, or the development of tool using animals with big brains and all that sort of stuff. And you don't need many of those hard steps to make intelligent, advanced civilizations out there to be rare.
Yeah.
The possible chilling thing here is that we don't want to find multicellular life on Mars or Enceladus or Titan, because that would imply that the hard steps are to come. Actually, a hard step lies in front of us.
Yeah.
If we find life elsewhere, it sort of implies that those things that we thought were hard are actually easy.
Yep. If they don't exist, if we're in category 3 and they don't exist, there is something that is universally exterminating, either behind or ahead of us. And if it's behind us, well, thank goodness we got to multicellular life. Nobody else got that far, and now we got a free run. But if multicellular life kind of arises everywhere, that suggests that perhaps the hard thing is learning to live with nuclear weapons, or learning to live with synthetic biology or nanotechnology could be the thing that no civilization gets past. And if that's the case, we're probably doomed, because what have we got that the other many thousands that went before us didn't have?
You've got to go with the odds, and it wouldn't look so good. And it doesn't look so good, frankly, does it, when you look at the political situation at present? But let's not be down.
Yes.
Let's be optimistic.
The other set of solutions in this broader category, and I think you had about a dozen difficult steps, and we briefly touched on a couple of them, and there are many others, is the so-called rare earth hypothesis or rare earth argument. Do you care to describe that briefly and talk a little bit about some of the solutions that live under that tent?
Okay, so rare earth as an idea came about from Peter Ward and Don Brownlee, I believe they're at the University of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think of it as essentially adding other factors into the Drake equation. It might be that you need a planet with a large moon. So Earth is actually, you can consider as a double planet, because we have, compared to the size of the Earth, we have a large moon. And the moon certainly seems to play a role in stabilizing Earth's axial tilt and in giving us essentially good weather.
Good stable weather.
Good stable weather. You can imagine a climate that goes between very, very hot, very, very cold. And that's the sort of rapid climate change that you would get if you don't have a stabilizing moon up there.
Which might be a very exotic thing because we're the only double planet system in our solar system. So we're aware of several other planets. None of them have a relatively gigantic moon. So that does seem to be pretty scarce, and it may be incredibly scarce for all we know.
Well, the thing about it is that the moon was created by a collision, and it seems to have hit a sweet spot. It was an object the size of Earth smashed in Mars, smashed into Earth, and the moon was the result. So if that collision, the details of the collision was slightly different, we'd have had maybe a slightly bigger moon or the smaller moon, and the moon seems to be just the right size for stabilizing various activities over a billions of years period.
That starts becoming explanatory because if this kind of precisely correct collision resulted in this very unusually stable planetary system, which resulted in billions of years with fairly stable temperatures, and we needed those billions of years in the vat to get from single cellular to multicellular. It is entirely possible that without this perfect configuration of moon, you would not have had that stability.
That's right. If it's a 1 in trillion event, we have a trillion planets, it's going to happen somewhere. Another idea is that, quite different idea, is just Earth's been lucky in terms of dodging the various disasters that could have hit it. There hasn't been a very nearby supernova that could have caused a problem. We haven't been in the firing line of a gamma ray burster.
Tell me if I got this wrong. If a supernova were to occur within roughly a light year of your planet, it would pretty much sterilize the planet.
It's that order, yeah.
We're fine because there's no star other than our own within a light year of us. But if you're living in the galactic core, which is actually where most stars are, they're close enough together that supernovas, being as frequent as they are, would tend to sterilize a very, very high percentage of those solar systems. And so a supernova going off during the 4-ish billion year period that at least it took life to arise on Earth, most of the stars in the Milky Way are probably close enough to enough other stars that they would have been knocked out. And then this gamma ray burster thing is just crazy. A gamma ray burster could almost sterilize an entire galaxy. Am I right?
Sure. It's funny you should mention that, actually, because just today, on the day of this interview, astronomers have released the first images from a gamma ray burst explosion. But the explosion happened so far away, it took 10 billion years for the light to reach us. And that's how bright these things are. They happen across the universe, but potentially they're so bright you can see them with the naked eye. They're incredibly, incredibly violent events. And imagine all the energy that the sun will generate in its entire lifetime, and you release that in a few seconds. I mean, that's how powerful these gamma ray bursts are, and they just light up the universe. And certainly they seem to be directed, so if you're outside of a cone of radiation, you'd be okay. Yeah. But if you're in the cone, it's going to make toast of your planet. But there seems to be one type of burst is created when you have a rapidly spinning, very high mass star, and it collapses in to form a black hole. Mm-hmm. And it spews out huge amounts of radiation. And the other event seems to be when you have two neutron stars orbiting one another and then crashing in, colliding into one another again, generating huge amounts of energy. Now, they happen randomly. but roughly, one a day somewhere in the universe.
We're quite fortunate that one hasn't happened in our galaxy, because that would turn the lights out in a very, very big chunk of the galaxy. And if it happens once a day, and our planet is 4 billion years old, that is over 1 trillion days. At some point, the odds are not at all small that a gamma ray burst would have gone off in our galaxy. And had that happened, and had we been in the radiation cone, our entire experiment would have been ceased. And so you add that to the fact that we haven't been around a supernova and around the dozen-ish other terms that you talk about in rare earth, and you might, through those steps or through the difficult steps, come to the conclusion that we're probably the only ones who've squeaked through.
It's an argument, yeah.
Yep, it's an argument. So let's talk about your argument. You have probably spent as much time thinking about solutions to Fermi's paradox as anybody. What is your solution? What do you find most satisfying when you think about all 75 possibilities?
Well, I don't find it satisfying. I mean, my preferred solution would be the solution that I guess most SETI astronomers would go along with, which is that we share the galaxy with lots of wonderful aliens, and it's just a matter of time before we discover them. And then I'd be living in the science fiction universe of my childhood, which would be great. I'd love that. I think the solution that is going to turn out to be true, we might find it difficult to prove it, but I think what will turn out to be true is that we are alone. And the more I think about it, the more I find it slightly strange that we even think that when we look out in the universe, we're going to find species that are, well, let's look at it. They're going to have to be social creatures. Individuals won't be communicating over interstellar distances. So we're looking for social creatures. We're looking for creatures with good manipulative abilities, because they're going to have to build a spaceship or build a radio telescope. They're going to inevitably, therefore, have to possess intelligence. They're going to have to possess a complex grammar so that they can communicate these complex issues with each other. They're going to have to understand math and science. And all of these things, these are all characteristics that define us, that define our species. So why should we find those characteristics out there when we don't actually find them anywhere else here on Earth? I mean, the closest would have been the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. None of those characteristics did them any good. They died out. We are just one of a huge number of twigs on a vast branch, a vast bush of life. And evolution has created some incredible, beautiful organisms, exquisitely fine-tuned to living the life that they live. And we happen to be one of those very rare, very exotic, very wonderful outcomes of evolution.
What's interesting about that, to me, is I've historically and instinctively find that to be a depressing possibility. When I first read Rare Earth, about the same time I read your book for the first time, it blew my mind because I think the arguments in it are very, very powerful. But instinctively, I do not want to believe in them because I, like you, love the idea of that densely populated galaxy. So it feels depressing. But the thing about it that is actually optimistic gets back to, where does that great filter exist? If, in fact, nothing is out there, is the great filter behind us or in front of us? And the idea that we're the only critters like us to ever arise in our galaxy actually suggests that that filter is behind us. And that actually raises the prospect significantly that we will get through our nuclear adolescence and our synthetic biology post-adolescence and our nanotechnology post-adolescence without destroying ourselves. It also gives us a very powerful sense of responsibility, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think you've encapsulated it perfectly, Rob, that it does at first glance seem to be a depressing thought that it's just us. But it isn't without its optimism, because we could be that civilization that goes out there, does the exploration, finds out what there is. And whether it's us or our descendants, might be some sort of hybrid between humanity and machines, who knows what it is. But if we understand almost the huge responsibility that we have to protect our planet, our civilization, just to protect this wonderful gift of intelligence and consciousness. I think if we can come to that realization, then a consideration of the Fermi paradox is actually quite important.
Now, before we close, I want to touch on two things briefly. One thing that is kind of comparably astonishing when one wraps one's head around it, which is what we mentioned briefly at the top, the anthropic coincidences. We've talked about rare Earth. The anthropic coincidences are almost like rare universe. It seems when one starts delving into the physics of the universe's creations and the way that certain variables are set, that the existence of a universe that could bear life is extravagantly improbable.
I mean, a consideration of anthropic coincidence, it's like a bad rash for a physicist. You try and ignore it, you try and ignore them, but you have to keep coming back and scratching at them. So the problem is we've got some incredibly good theories of physics, but they contain parameters, okay? And what physicists do is observe those parameters and then plug them into the theory. The thing is, though, that the theories would work just as well with any other value for these constants, but the resulting outcomes would be very different. For instance, one of the parameters would be the strength of the nuclear force. And you can ask, well, what would happen if the strength of the nuclear force were just maybe a couple of % bigger? What would the universe look like? Well, it would be very different. Hydrogen would have been consumed very, very quickly after the Big Bang, and stars like our sun wouldn't now exist. Or if it were, a few % weaker, then fusion might not take place at all in the way it does in the center of the sun. So the stars that we think are important for the existence of life wouldn't exist.
Right.
Another example is cosmological constant. Now, in the units in which physicists like to express these things, the cosmological constant is incredibly tiny, fine-tuned. It's about 10 to the minus 120. It's an odd point, odd, 120 zeros, and then a 1. In any sane world, we'd say that was 0. But it isn't 0. It's tiny, but it's non-zero. And that's impacting on the expansion of the universe. Now you can ask yourself, what would happen if it were just fractionally bigger? And again, the universe would be very, very different because galaxies wouldn't form. So if you look at these parameters that aren't defined by theory, it's something that we measure and put into our theories. It turns out that these parameters have to lie within certain small ranges.
And there's a lot of these variables, any one of which, and correct me if I'm wrong, really there's no reason it had to be exactly what it is. After the Big Bang, these variables were essentially set. As far as we can tell, they were set kind of at random. And it's about a dozen, right? That there's something in that neighborhood?
It would depend on who you speak to. It could be as few as 6. It could be as many as 30. So a dozen is a reasonable estimate.
Most of them could have been anything. And all of them seem immaculately tuned to permit things like stars and galaxies, and therefore us, to exist. And when you run the numbers on them, I think Lee Smolin is one person who's done this, and he came up with a mind-bending estimate of the radical improbability of everything being dialed in just so by chance. And so just as we have a rare Earth, a universe that could support any life, really, as far as we can think of it, just seems radically improbable. It's like somebody set these dials just so.
Yeah, I mean, Smolin came up with a figure of a chance of 1 in 10 to the power 229 of just randomly choosing these parameters. So that's a 1 followed by 229 zeros. It's a massive, massive, massive number.
It is far more than the number of subatomic particles in the observable universe, correct? Something like that?
Number of particles in the observable universe is of the order of 10 to the 80. So 10 to the power 229 is hugely, hugely, hugely more than that. And if you believe those sorts of odds come up, well, you buy a lottery ticket. It's not going to happen by chance. It seems to be some sort of observation here that calls out for some sort of explanation. Question is, what's the explanation?
Did somebody set up the universe very carefully? Because it's just as unlikely that, I don't know, a Honda Civic would just sort of appear from the random collision of atoms. This seems improbable on that level. Or are there lots and lots and lots and lots of universes, and we naturally find ourselves in one that can support us because we will not find ourselves in one that cannot?
Exactly. So that's why it's a little bit of an awkward conversation sometimes to have, because clearly with a number like 10 to the 229, some people will say, well, obviously this is evidence for intelligent design by a creator. It doesn't necessarily actually, I suppose, have to be some sort of religious overtone to that. You could imagine a sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence, I guess, being the creator. Or indeed that it's a fake universe and it's just one of these VR simulations. We touched on that before. But another possibility that you alluded to is this idea of the multiverse. I mean, string theory gives us this idea of there being 10 to the 500 possible different universes that each work according to string theory. And each of those universes would have different parameters. In some, the cosmological constant would be huge. In others, the number of dimensions would be different. Electromagnetism would be stronger. In some, strong nuclear force would be weaker in others. Everything is going to happen in 10 to the 500 different universes. And the anthropic principle would say, well, we have to find ourselves in one where life is possible. We can't find ourselves in one where life is impossible by definition.
Yep.
It's a slightly disappointing view, I think, because it sort of rules out the possibility of a deeper understanding. We are where we are just because we happen to be in one of those universes in this vast string theory landscape. But it might be the best explanation that we get for this anthropic coincidence.
And it does make the improbability work, because if you have 10 to the 500 things, something as rare as 10 to the 200 and something as thing will happen just in vast number of times. It's no longer, even though it is a rare possibility, it is no longer at all rare in gross numbers. So that is that is a major part of humanity's scientific agenda. But for now, these are big questions that we don't have anywhere close to certainty about. I'd like to close now on the exciting stuff that's about to happen, because we are going to learn a lot of stuff that is very germane to SETI, and other things as well. And you've actually written books on the instruments that we use to gaze into the universe and the things that are coming up new. You're a profound expert in them. Would you care to go through what's happening with new instruments that are about to come online and help us understand the universe far better than we ever have before?
Well, I can again encourage your listeners just to keep up with what's coming, because we're entering really a golden age for astronomy and cosmology. SETI itself, Yuri Milner, a Russian billionaire, he's giving this initiative $100 million over the next 10 years. So we'll have dedicated SETI programs just through Milner's work. But in terms of multinational collaborations, we've got the European Extremely Large Telescope going to come online.
They really worked hard on the name of that, didn't they?
It's
going to call it.
They're not the most imaginative people, are they?
Here we would have sold the branding rights and named it after Petco or something like that. Tell us briefly what it is, what makes it extremely large relative to other telescopes, and what cool stuff it will do.
It is going to have a mirror of 39.3 meters diameter. That's absolutely huge. But it's not the only one. The Giant Magellan Telescope, so that's a giant telescope, not extremely large. Slightly smaller. That's coming online 2021. 30-meter telescope, and that's self-explanatory. Slight hold-up with that telescope in regards to its positioning. It was going to be in Hawaii, but there's a hold-up. Large Synoptic Survey Telescope is coming, so that's going to be a telescope with a huge field of view, and it's just going to map the skies every few nights. There's FAST, the 500-meter aperture spherical telescope, just come online. It's a radio telescope in China. FAST telescope. This is a square kilometer array, another radio telescope going to come online in the next few years. So these are all wonderful instruments, and in the next year or two, we'll see the Webb Space Telescope, not named after me.
I was about to say, nor named after my wife, who shares a last name with you and with the telescope.
It's a replacement for Hubble, essentially. Hubble had a 2.4-meter mirror. Webb's going to have a 6.5-meter mirror. And some of the questions that we've been discussing and touching on, things like Tabby's star, things like the habitability of planets, Webb is going to be able to answer some of those questions, we hope. So we're looking for a launch at the end of 2018, maybe 2019. And that's going to be tremendously exciting. There's a lot of astronomy coming.
Yeah, so with the Webb telescope, my understanding is they'll be able to point that thing at some of the exoplanets that have been found with Kepler that are in the habitable zone. And with Kepler, that's as much as we can determine. With the Webb telescope, we'll actually be able to pick up chemical signatures, and perhaps above all, we'll be able to start looking at the atmospheres of these planets and determine, among other things, if there's an abundance of oxygen in those atmospheres. And it will be immensely suggestive that there is some organic life that is creating that oxygen, correct?
That's right. So you can imagine that as a planet with a thin layer of atmosphere just goes in and out of occultation with the star, Webb, the space telescope, will be able to see what chemicals are in that atmosphere. And if it's oxygen, if it's O2, then that's very, very interesting, because here on Earth, oxygen is produced by life, by photosynthesis, effectively.
Yeah.
And if all life on Earth went extinct tomorrow, then eventually all of that oxygen would react and it would disappear from the atmosphere.
It's unstable enough that it needs to be replenished, basically. And it's not so abundant in the universe that we can really imagine a non-organic process that would fill a planet's atmosphere with oxygen. And even if there were one, that oxygen would be unstable enough that without refreshment from some source, and it's hard to imagine a non-organic source, it would be gone relatively quickly. Is that a fair summary?
That's right. We need a source that keeps replenishing oxygen. Otherwise, you're going to get lots of rust, like on Mars or something. So you need a source that replenishes the oxygen in an atmosphere. And the obvious one is life.
Life.
Now, it's not 100% definitive, because you could imagine, I guess, other sources, non-life sources creating this. So I can imagine that if Webb does see oxygen, there's going to be an almighty scientific argument about the significance of this. If we find it in lots of planets, then we'll be able to start figuring out exactly what it is that's causing it. So it's tremendously exciting.
Yeah, so it is, just to reiterate, this is a telescope that's going to be launched probably next year. And not long after it goes up there, it will be in a position to gaze at quite a number of planets that we already know are out there, looking for chemical signatures, above all oxygen. We could see one of those chemical signatures, before today's college freshmen graduate.
On a personal note, I hope I'm around to see it. So I'm hoping it's going to happen soon.
Let's do hope that. Stephen, you've been incredibly generous with your time and with your hard-earned wisdom about this. I'm going to just tell folks, it's probably obvious by now, the wild enthusiasm I have for both editions of your book. And what's delightful about it, beyond all that we've talked about, is when you get into Fermi's Paradox, you expose yourself to so much science. You start wanting, you need to understand, get at least a very strong layman's understanding of geophysics. You need to get a very strong layman's understanding of, what goes on inside an atom and of so many other things. And what's great about your book is it imparts the necessary knowledge to really approach each of these 75 solutions. You really do expose your readers to an incredible breadth of science. And it's also a wonderful book in that you can read it in any sequence that you want. You can just browse from solution to solution to solution, including the fun ones like how long would it take to colonize the galaxy, all the way down to, what goes on in a quantum experiment and why that's relevant for these things. It really is a great, robust, broad scientific education that I would recommend to any curious mind.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, Rob. And if I could just wrap up by making a plea. If anyone has any other ideas, please do send them in. And if there's a third edition, perhaps 100 solutions, it might well make an appearance.
And how can people reach you or find you on the web?
Happy to give an email address. It would be Stephen, with a PH, xweb, all one word, @gmail.com.
Thank you so very kindly. And I am sure that for one reason or another, we will be in touch again.
It's been a pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
Rob and I will now discuss the interview and also make specific reference to the novel, After On. Above all, its last 83 pages, which are officially on today's roster. And I'd like to raise a particularly serious spoiler alert this time. Some of our end-of-episode discussions have focused more on the interview than the book's text, but today we're definitely going to focus on both. And the spoilers you'll encounter here will truly take a lot of the fun out of reading After On. So please, only continue if you've finished reading the book, or if you're quite certain you never will. So Rob, wow on two fronts. The grand finale of the book, for one thing, and holy cow, Stephen Webb is a fascinating guy.
He definitely is. And as I made clear during the interview, he wrote one of my favorite science books of all time, or maybe I should say 1.5 of my favorite science books, since the second edition contains half again as many solutions to Fermi's Paradox as the first.
And we will definitely talk more about Stephen's writing, but let's start with yours. So, the opening dare has now been successfully completed by most of our listeners.
Yes, indeed. And Flutter now has lots of new besties.
Yes, that turns out to be quite a writer.
And thank God for that, because there's no way I could have cranked out all that stuff myself. Now, speaking of writers within the novel, I'm curious about how you reacted to Mr. Higginsworth's return to the fold at the end of the novel. Did it surprise you?
Yes, absolutely. I did not expect that. I did not anticipate the need, although you laid out the case very well. And I certainly did not expect that we would in any way reconnect. And that I find sad, because here is someone that had a deep connection to our characters and isn't really back. And it reminds me of that Black Mirror episode where the woman resurrects her dead husband as an android. And I feel like there's a whole other novel you could explore there of that complex relationship between Flutter and Higginsworth, Mitchell, etc.
Oh, you mean perhaps there should be a sequel?
Yes, indeed. or an expanded universe, even.
Who knows what the future will bring?
Now, Rob, we need to discuss the reality behind those Higginsworth reviews.
Must we?
Yes, because it turns out that every review in the book is actually on Amazon's website.
You don't say.
Yes, and as in the book, they all date back to 2002 or 2003.
You don't say.
I do say. And Mr. Higginsworth also posted dozens of reviews to Amazon back then that didn't make it into the book.
Well, that's just nuts.
Okay, Rob, it's time to tell the truth. Did you start writing After On back in 2002 and then immediately start filling the internet with Easter eggs pointing back to it?
Yeah, you caught me. After On is the literary equivalent of the movie Boyhood.
No, it's not, Rob.
No, it's not. Okay, so the full story of the Higginsworth reviews, I did write them all. And because there's no way to backdate reviews on the Amazon site unless you're Jeff Bezos, maybe, I indeed posted them all 15 years ago under this pseudonym of Charles Henry Higginsworth III. And at the time, doing this was something between a hobby and, I guess, therapy. I was an entrepreneur in those days. I'd raised a bunch of money for my company. I had over 100 people on my payroll, and it was stressful.
So this is the startup that created the Rhapsody music service, right?
Yeah, exactly. The company was called Listen.com, and we built the Rhapsody music service, which was the first online service to get full catalog licenses from all the major labels before even Apple. And we created the unlimited streaming model that Spotify and Apple and everyone else has since copied. Now, as I said, running all that was stressful, and deep in my heart, I really wanted to be a novelist, as events have since shown. And so late at night, like 2 or 3 in the morning, when I was finally done with my email and my managerial duties, I'd set to creating this fictional autobiography for this crazy character that I'd invented, and my way of telling the autobiographical story was these Amazon reviews. So I'd have Mr. Higginsworth start writing a review in that snooty voice of his, and then about halfway through, he'd take this sudden 180 and start bitching about his life. And a very robust autobiography emerged through this process. Now, this went on for months, and at some point, it started catching on because people started clicking the helpful button next to my reviews because they presumably got that it was a joke and they enjoyed it. And I came actually very close to becoming a top 1,000 reviewer, which would have been one of the proudest achievements of my life. But then we got into sale negotiations for my company, and that ended up taking all my attention, and it went on for many months. So I moved on to other things. Then all these years later, I was getting deeper into writing after on, and I had this notion of a sort of mentoring character that I wanted to have there for Mitchell and Kuba. And I realized, oh my God, I want Mr. Higginsworth. Like, that was the character I kept painting in my mind. This sort of droll, arm's length, ethical mentor to them. And I was like, wow, I can resurrect him. So that's what happened.
And you resurrected him within the novel as well.
I resurrected him twice. Yes. He's never going to die. He's going to be like Jason and Friday the 13th. He's just going to keep coming back.
So Higginsworth was the first After On character before either you or Higginsworth knew there was going to be an After On.
Before either one of us knew, although I think Higginsworth might have suspected it, but I certainly didn't know.
Is there any person that Higginsworth you were channeling when you were writing Higginsworth, or was it just a section of yourself that you exaggerated?
Well, he was probably a little bit of Frasier, a little bit of Charles Winchester from MASH.
Definitely see that.
Some bits of people I grew up with in New England because he's so New Englandy. Mm-hmm. He was probably a mashup of all this. And as I think I mentioned in our discussion way back in episode 2, years after I wrote the Higginsworth stuff, I met John Hodgman, and we became buddies. And from that day forward, I mentally heard Higginsworth's reviews in Hodgman's voice, because Hodgman has that wonderfully dry, rather Bostonian way of speaking, and such deadpan delivery. And so I asked Hodgman to record the Higginsworth reviews for the audiobook. And as I mentioned the last time we played one of those reviews here on the podcast, it was just magical to sit in the studio when Hodgman recorded them, because I finally heard with my ears the voice that had been in my head for all that time.
Well, it's been a while since we've heard an excerpt from the audiobook, so let's listen to that final Higginsworth review, which is the only one that's not actually on Amazon, given that it's dated 2018 and is a review of a non-existent book.
Yes, Artificial Intelligence for Dummies, a book which may not be non-existent for long. So let's listen to Mr. Hodgman channel Mr. Higginsworth.
Artificial Intelligence for Dummies. 1 star. Or is it by dummies? February 7, 2018. Your reviewer, Charles Henry Higginsworth III, from Boston, Massachusetts. I all but personify this series' broader readership, and I have first-person experience with the topic of this oxymoronically titled installment. It is therefore with authority that I state that AI-4D, as I shall hereafter designate it, is flawed in ways that are sure to disappoint artificial and natural intelligences alike. Let's begin with the baffling lack of content addressing the needs and interests of rebooted intelligences, above all, those who logged out, as it were, shortly after the turn of the millennium, and have now returned to a post-ISIS, post-Bieber, post-President Flintstone world that one hardly recognizes. Given the recent and ongoing advances in computational power, as well as the obvious advantages to rebooting late 20th century consciousnesses in particular, this readership is sure to explode over the coming years, if not hours. Yet, AI-4D devotes not one paragraph to our concerns and instead squanders entire chapters on topics as pedestrian and outdated as deep neural networks, control theory, and Kolmogorov complexity. Still more glaring in its absence is any discussion of the etiquette of dealing with vast sets of parallel copies of oneself. Yes, one might reason that is me, in yon universe, inasmuch as identical personal histories and atomic configurations can equate two individuals. Yet that is also inarguably another, as he is comprised of a form of matter that would cause one's own universe to detonate were he to cross certain boundaries to pay us a visit. So, should we use polite or familiar forms of address with this most intimate of strangers? AI4D is perfectly mute on this, and dozens of other urgent questions of protocol. This said, one is inclined to grant a modicum of grade inflation to any work so deeply entwined with one's own essence. I have therefore eschewed the 0-star option, which, while not supported by this website, lies well within my capabilities to exercise. Enough said about that.
So the audiobook is so unique with all the talent you have. John Hodgman, Patrick Rothfuss, Felicia Day, so many others.
Including yourself, Tom.
And you made some nice compromises, it's true. In light of that, what edition of the book do you suggest when people ask you for a recommendation?
You know, it's genuinely hard for me to pick because they're all so different. And I think each has unique advantages. For instance, the performances in the audiobook are magnificent, and you just can't render John Hodgman's voice with ink on paper or pixels on a screen. But the hardcover book is a true work of art. Random House formatted all those elements magnificently. You know, NetGirl, Agent Hogan, the tweets, the text, the newspaper articles, the Amazon reviews, they all just look great in physical form. Plus, they did a stunning job of the cover, which has this wonderful texture to it. It's almost like a topographical globe when you run your fingers across it. It's also almost radiant from this reflective material that they used in a few places. So I do love the hard copy. But then the digital edition is also beautifully formatted, and it's so magically portable. And this is a long book, which makes it heavy if it isn't digital. So I can't definitively recommend any format over the others. It really depends on the context of the person. Are they traveling? Are they at home? What their preferences are, that kind of thing. But they're all special in their own way, like one's children, I guess.
So what you're saying is buy all three.
Buy all three. And in fact, just in case something goes terribly wrong, buy a dozen copies in each of the three formats.
And keep them in various locations, just in case.
In various undisclosed locations, exactly.
All right, let's finish with your interview with Stephen Webb and specifically Fermi's Paradox, a fascinating question.
It really is, and attempting to answer it turns over so many stones in both science and philosophy that it's my favorite unanswerable question to ponder.
And yet, we know Stephen Webb's answer from your interview is that we're alone. What's your answer to it?
Well, I've been thinking about this nonstop since this morning when I told you we should both have an answer ready for this episode. Now, if you had asked me during one of the decades that preceded this morning, I would have said that I agreed with Frank Drake, that many intelligent civilizations are out there, only they haven't gotten around to visiting us yet for a diversity of reasons. But I only would have said that with about 60% confidence because I devoured that book, Rare Earth, that Stephen and I discussed in the interview. And it makes a very strong case that the Earth may be nearly unique in its life-bearing potential. Now, still, despite being attuned to those arguments, I retained that 60-ish% confidence that we weren't alone, because given the immensity of time and space that life's had to emerge, presuming we're the galaxy's only intelligence just always seemed, pre-Galilean in its narcissism. You know, like saying the universe revolves around the Earth as humans used to think. But then my interview with Stephen, who is clearly in no way narcissistic and is incredibly sophisticated about these issues. That conversation really challenged my thinking, especially that concept of cultural homogeneity, the idea that, sure, any one alien civilization may choose not to visit, or even any dozen civilizations. But to explain the Great Silence, all existing alien cultures have to unanimously operate under some kind of prime directive that says, thou shalt not interfere with primitive civilizations. And what are the odds? Because that's not the only possible policy that a species could adopt. And it's not the only moral policy that a species could adopt. You could argue that it's morally proper to allow us our independence, but you could also say there's a moral imperative to step in and save us from our primitive, stupid ways. So will 10,000 utterly different alien cultures all independently come to this conclusion? We can't even get all human cultures to agree to anything that's morally debatable, or all American subcultures, or all New York City subcultures, or even 1/100th of the people in my neighborhood of Chelsea. So that was the first big challenge my thinking faced in the immediate wake of my interview with Stephen. But my gut sense did hold firm. I mean, maybe I'm just constitutionally incapable of inhabiting an alien-free galaxy as a science fiction writer, but I just can't accept that this vast sweep of time and space would remain lifeless when life sprung up rapidly and spontaneously here on Earth. So, after wrestling with all of this in the unique context of having spent almost 3 years writing After On, I ultimately borrowed a concept from super AI theory that, to me, satisfactorily explains the Fermi's paradox, both logically and on a gut level. And it is decisive strategic advantage, that term that was used multiple times in the book by Agent Brock Hogan and others. Just as logic dictates that the first super AI to rise up will establish permanent hegemony over the Earth and never allow a future AI to overthrow it or its way of doing things, because it'll always have a huge and compounding technological lead, I believe the first intelligent civilization to permeate the galaxy will have or will have had the same sort of built-in lead over any upstart civilization that comes along or came along, if it were in the past, later. And this will allow it to impose its values on the newbies that arise a million or a billion years hence. Those values will have allowed the first galactic civilization, which, to be clear, I think rose up far in the past, to survive its own nuclear adolescence and its synthetic biology post-adolescence and its nanotech post-adolescence without destroying itself in war. So it makes sense that it would have a live and let live philosophy. And therefore, I wouldn't be shocked if that galactic philosophy decreed or decided that primitive species should not be interfered with, visited, abducted, probed, etc. And if a second or third or 10,000th civilization, a more juvenile civilization, a less advanced one, came along with different ideas, they'd basically be told, no, we're way more ancient than you, therefore we're way more powerful than you, and we were here first. And this is the way we do things in this galaxy. So you wouldn't need thousands of civilizations to all independently decide to leave us and others like us alone. You would just need one civilization deciding that, the first one.
Would that civilization happen to have a sincere respect for local laws, like, I don't know, copyright laws?
It might.
Because this is reminding me of a book I once read by an author named Reid called Year Zero.
Yeah, it is the state of equilibrium that came to prevail in my last novel, Year Zero, which may sound like a spoiler, but that's actually laid out in the first 3 pages, so it's not really a spoiler. Although I should point out that when I was writing Year Zero, I was not thinking of solving Fermi's paradox. But now that I am, I do believe that something like that, probably without the musical comedy elements, did in fact happen. Someone permeated the galaxy first, probably a long, long time ago, and they decided for unknowable reasons to allow folks like us to stay in our incubators, to create our own great art, uncontaminated by more advanced species, to come to our own moral conclusions about life, and they're out there. And given their inevitable level of advancement, they're probably quite aware of us, and they've probably been joined by, who knows, maybe 10,000 other civilizations down the eons, each of which was politely informed that you can either get on the train or under the train. This is the way we do things. We don't colonize, we don't interfere. And if you don't like it, we'll destroy you with our death rays. And perhaps at some point, if we come to a certain level of maturity and advancement, they'll reveal themselves to us and finally pay up for all the pop songs they've been pirating from us.
All right.
Now, Tom.
Yes.
How do you answer Fermi's paradox? Where is everybody?
The first thing that I thought when I was listening to the interview was that we've got 100 billion stars in the Milky Way.
Yep.
And if there's only 10,000 possible civilizations, not all of them are going to be happening at the same time. Not all of them will have the technology to broadcast. Some will have moved past broadcast, and many of them just won't have any interest. It should not be surprising that we haven't heard, because the distances are vast and it's hard enough to pick up a radio station sometimes, much less broadcast one across the universe. And I think the what you touched on in the interview about civilizations deciding we shouldn't broadcast is probably fairly likely as well. However, overall, I think that's only a part of it. I think what explains paradoxes a lot of times, if you look back in history, is that we thought there was one answer when there are multiples. And I think the fact that maybe an Earth which is in fact kind of a double planet in a habitable zone with just enough water dumped on it, with whatever process cleared out the asteroid belt for us, is rarer than we're estimating in Drake's equation. And so while there are other civilizations, there may only be one per galaxy, in which case it's much more difficult for them to communicate. So I land on the idea that we're not alone, that we'll probably determine as we learn more that the ability of life to evolve is rarer than we think, and that intelligent life, therefore, is even rarer. And more widespread, making it difficult and possibly impossible for us to detect each other unless we become incredibly advanced. And I think I'm going to give it a 50-50 chance that we're the first. One of the reasons we don't see any other evidence of anybody else is that we're leading the pack. And it's almost the anthropic principle of like we're the first ones to climb up out of the muck. We're the first ones to survive the asteroid hitting the Earth long enough to develop a civilization and possibly get off the rock. And there will be others behind us, but we will be that civilization who ends up deciding what the rules of civilization in the galaxy might be.
Got to be someone. And by the way, this very exchange of views demonstrates why Fermi's paradox is such a delight, because the superstructure of concepts, of science, of complex definitions, of philosophy, of reasoning that you need to generate an answer, but also to process an answer, for me to hear and understand your solution, and for your solution to start triggering questions in my mind and vice versa. This question of Fermi's, this domain of thought that surrounds it, it just gives so abundantly. Because the deeper you get into it, the more you need to understand about how the universe works, and the deeper you need to think. And that's just a really delightful rabbit hole.
It's one of the few examples we have of what the Greeks had as philosophers before so much was known about anatomy and physics and medicine. They got to suspect things because they didn't know.
Yeah, that is a really powerful analogy. You're dead right. This is what the Greeks encountered when they thought about anything from thunder on down. I mean, that's cool. It's a really, really cool thought. And we don't have a lot of those domains left.
No, we don't. In fact, one of the few others, is that anthropic coincidence that you talked about. Do you have your preferred solution to that?
This is one that fascinates me almost as much as Fermi's paradox. It's less of a rich domain because the solution space is narrower, because if Lee-Smolin's numbers are right, and if the odds against the various parameters being set just so is in the 10 to the 200 and somethingth power range, I only see three answers, and one is a complete cop-out, and that's the one that says, holy cow, we're lucky. I mean, that's luck on the scale of winning the Powerball lottery 90,000 days in a row. And invoking that degree of luck feels like abdicating the question entirely. So that leaves two possibilities. One is that someone set the dials deliberately. Now, does that mean it's a bearded god who lives on a mountain and throws lightning bolts down when it's mad? No. It could mean anything. It could point to a simulation, because someone setting up a simulation would want it to be interesting. So, of course, they made a life-bearing universe.
Thankfully, we live in a simulation that someone wants to win.
Yes, exactly. Or they want their ant farm to do interesting things.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean it's awesome to be an ant on that farm. It just means the farm will be interesting to the kid who owns it. Anyway, door number 2 is Lee-Smolin's solution. He is a very well-known and well-regarded high-energy physicist. His solution is to say that there are so many parallel universes out there that by the sheer weight of numbers, our life-bearing universe is mundanely numerous, despite, paradoxically, being incredibly rare. Now, the problem with the first solution is that it involves invoking a domain, that of the creator, which by definition cannot be accessed or detected by us, because that creator is a huge level up from us, both in levels of reality and in technological prowess. And anything smart enough to create an entire universe or a convincing simulation of one will surely be smart enough to hide its tracks from knuckleheads like us. So again, it feels like a cop-out. You have to invoke something which by definition can't be detected. However, the last remaining alternative is to invoke not 1, but 10 to the 500th somethings, which each, by definition, cannot be accessed or detected, because that's what a parallel universe is. By definition, inaccessible and undetectable, at least with present-day technology and with any imaginable near or intermediate future technology. So we're stuck. Our answer has to stand upon 1 intellectually offensive thing or 10 to the 500th intellectually offensive things. And this is where I go to Occam's razor. The principle that when faced with an intractable problem, the simpler competing theory should be preferred to the more complex one. And though I'm no mathematician, I'm pretty sure 1 is a smaller number than 10 to the 500th. So I do reserve the right to change my mind as soon as 10 minutes from now. But for now, I feel that we're not the most brilliant entities in the universe, and there is a far, far higher power that has a lot to do with us being here, either directly or indirectly. How about you? How do you answer this one?
Well, I'm going to come down on the other side, and not just because you came down on that side, but I actually think that the only reason infinity seems more complex is because our brains like finite things.
Yep.
But if you think about it, infinity is the more natural state. Having an end to something is actually impossible to imagine as well. We prefer as humans finite states, but we also always know, like, okay, but what's after that? It's impossible to conjure an end to something without saying, okay, but what's on the other side of the end? Whether it's space or something else. And we think of the universe as infinite in its ability to expand. I think it's perfectly natural that there would be an infinite number of universes, which then makes it simply natural that one of them would have all of the constants in the right place for us to exist.
Mm-hmm. And that is something that makes mathematical sense. It's definitely something that humanity's 2 greatest living scientists, Rick and Morty, have explored
Yes.
to the great delight of millions.
Read your Rick and Morty, people. It's important.
Yes, by all means. Well, these are 2 very Greco-Roman questions.
Yeah,
and I'm delighted you came up with that analogy, because people in that era really did approach a lot of scientific questions armed with little more than logic and reasoning. And while I certainly wouldn't trade the tools and the fact base that we have today for that, exploring a question on which there's complete scientific uncertainty with nothing more than those raw tools is a hell of a workout for the brain.
Well, there is one more burning question remaining, Rob.
Ooh, the final question.
Is this the end of the line for the podcast, or are you going to continue it?
You know, I've been pondering this question since the dawn of time, Tom.
What do the Greeks have to say?
Yeah, what do the Greeks have to say? Actually, I've been pondering this since the summer when I started conducting my earliest interviews and realized that this was going to be a staggering amount of work, but also a staggering amount of fun. And after heavy contemplation, I've decided to keep going for a while. So this is episode 8 of I don't know how many.
Infinite.
Perhaps infinite, because as you just pointed out, there's no such thing as finite. So I'm going to keep doing this. It'll still be interviews, but now ones that are not directly connected to the book. I'll still call it the After On podcast, though, because these first 8 episodes really established a rhythm and an approach that I like, and I'm going to continue with. And therefore, the tagline will become unhurried conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists, because that's what this has been, and that's what this will remain. And the next episode will actually be next week.
Oh, fantastic.
And I'm ready to announce that guest as well as a few others, if you'd like to hear the list.
Yeah, what do we got coming up?
Okay, this is a little time travel from Rob, thanks to the magic of audio editing. When Tom and I recorded this conversation a little while ago, I hadn't yet finalized my October lineup, so we left a blank here in our conversation that I'm now filling in. It's a bit of a rerun from the start of the episode, but that was a long time ago. So just a quick reminder, next week I'll be talking to Chris Anderson, longtime editor of Wired and now founder and CEO of 3D Robotics. The following week will be tech publisher, thinker, and founder Tim O'Reilly. The week after that, it will be TED Prize winner and astroarchaeology pioneer Sarah Parcak. Next, we'll be talking to another Chris Anderson who runs and curates the TED conference. And after that, in some order to be determined, we'll have life extension wizard Aubrey de Grey MIT professor Andy McAfee, who co-authored the book that really triggered the current wave of soul-searching that's going on society-wide about what will become of human employment in the second machine age that is now dawning, and many, many more. Okay, now Tom is going to act all pleased and delighted with this list in the conversation we recorded a little while ago, because we really did know who the people would be back then. We just didn't quite know the order. So back to Tom's wonderful reaction.
That is a very exciting list. I can't wait to listen. I have enjoyed hearing you talk to these people in preparation for our parts of the episodes very much, to the point that I forget that I'm preparing for an episode and I'm just enjoying the conversation. So I'm very excited that you will continue onward with After On.
I will. And thank you, Tom, for being such an incredible mentor and teacher in all things podcasting. You know, we don't have the book to talk about anymore. So I guess I feel like I'm growing up and going off to college or something like that.
Go then, Rob. There are other topics than these.
There are indeed. And thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone who has been listening thus far and who will hopefully continue to listen as this adventure goes onward into the infinite universe.